Somewhere beneath the modern streets of Alexandria, in tunnels no one has fully mapped, in chambers sealed by sand and time and the weight of centuries, the most famous tomb in human history may still be waiting to be found. For 400 years, people came from across the known world to stand before the body of the man who conquered that world. Kings came, emperors came, soldiers and scholars and pilgrims came, and then, one day, without warning, without explanation, he was simply gone. The tomb was empty. No one knows where the body went. No one has ever found him since. But to understand how a tomb can vanish, how a monument can disappear, how the greatest man of an age can become lost in time, we must first understand the man it held. Let's go back. Go back far beyond the empires we know, far beyond the cities we've read about, far beyond even the reach of Rome. Let's go back to a place called Pella in the ancient kingdom of Macedon. The place was smaller then, quieter. The mountains around it were wild, the roads were unpaved, but inside the palace walls something extraordinary was about to happen. July 20th or 21st, 356 before the Common Era. Precise dates were kept for this occasion, because even then people knew they were witnessing something important. A queen named Olympias was in labour. She was the daughter of the king of Epirus, a neighbouring kingdom. She had come to Macedon to be the wife of King Philip II, one of the most ambitious military leaders of his age. Philip had unified the Macedonian kingdom. He had brought under his control territories that had previously been independent. He was expanding Macedonian power in all directions, and now his wife was giving birth. Historical accounts claim that on the same day Alexander was born, 3 important events happened in distant places. Philip's general Parmenion won a great military victory far to the east. Philip's beloved horse, Bucephalus, was born on the same day. A temple was burned to the ground in Ephesus, one of the great cities of Greece. Whether these events actually coincided, or whether later writers simply invented this symmetry to suggest that Alexander's birth was cosmically significant, we may never know. But the ancient writers all mention them. They suggest that the world itself was announcing that something extraordinary had arrived. The child was named Alexander. He was raised in the palace of Pella, surrounded by soldiers and courtiers and the machinery of a kingdom constantly at war. His father Philip was a man of action. He spent much of his time leading armies. Alexander grew up watching his father expand the Macedonian territories, watching him negotiate with neighbouring kingdoms, watching him plan battles and strategy. These were his first lessons. This was his childhood education: strength, power, victory. But Philip was not a man who believed in strength alone. He understood something crucial that many conquerors have never learned. A kingdom built on military power alone cannot last. It crumbles, it falls apart, it fragments after the conqueror dies. To make a kingdom that would endure, you needed more. You needed wisdom. You needed philosophy. You needed a ruler who could understand not just how to win battles, but how to think about complex problems, how to lead, how to inspire loyalty. And so Philip made a decision that would shape his son's entire destiny. In 343 before the Common Era, when Alexander was 13 years old, Philip arranged for the greatest teacher in Greece to come to Macedon. His name was Aristotle. Aristotle was not yet the famous philosopher he would become, but he was already recognized as a brilliant thinker. He had studied in Athens at Plato's academy, learning from the greatest minds of the Greek world. He understood natural science and philosophy, logic and rhetoric, poetry and ethics. He understood the way the world worked. Philip offered Aristotle something no university could offer: a student unlike any other, a student who would one day rule an empire, a student whose ideas would shape the future of the world. And Philip offered him something else: money, enormous wealth, whatever Aristotle needed to teach properly. Aristotle accepted. He came to Macedon, and he took Alexander to a place called Mieza. There, at a temple dedicated to the nymphs of the forest, away from the noise and chaos of the palace, Aristotle and Alexander began their work together. What did Aristotle teach? The ancient sources tell us: logic, the art of thinking clearly; rhetoric, the art of speaking persuasively. He taught Alexander poetry, the works of Homer and other great writers. He taught him ethics, how to think about right and wrong, about virtue and vice. He taught him astronomy, the movements of the stars and the nature of the heavens. He taught him geography. He taught him zoology, the natural sciences, the way animals lived and behaved. He taught him about plants and rocks and the physical world. But more importantly, Aristotle taught Alexander how to think, how to question assumptions, how to examine the world carefully, how to reason from evidence. The method that Aristotle used was unusual. They didn't sit in a classroom. Instead, they walked together through the gardens and groves near the Temple of the Nymphs. As they walked, they talked. Aristotle asked questions. Alexander answered. They debated ideas. They examined problems from every angle. For 4 years, from 343 to 340 before the Common Era, this was Alexander's life, walking and talking, learning to think like a philosopher and a king. And Aristotle gave Alexander something else, a book, the Iliad, the ancient epic poem written by Homer centuries before. The Iliad told the story of the Trojan War. It described the great warrior Achilles, who was brave and noble but also tragic and flawed. It described heroes and battles and the search for honour and glory. Alexander carried that book with him for the rest of his life, even when he was far from home, even when he was sleeping in a tent after a military victory. That copy of the Iliad was with him. The book shaped how he saw himself. It told him stories of what a hero should be. Aristotle was teaching other young nobles at the same time. 2 of them would become important later in our story. One was a boy named Ptolemy, another was a boy named Hephaestion. Ptolemy would eventually become Alexander's general, and then the founder of a dynasty that would rule Egypt for 300 years. Hephaestion would become Alexander's closest friend. Neither boy could have imagined, sitting in those gardens at Mieza, that they would help shape the future of the Mediterranean world. In 340 before the Common Era, Alexander's education was complete. He was 18 years old. He left Mieza and returned to Macedon. He began to take part in his father's government. He began to learn about statecraft and military command. He participated in Philip's campaigns. He gained experience as a soldier and as a leader. He was becoming ready for kingship. But kingship came faster than anyone expected. In 336 before the Common Era, in the month of October, Philip II was assassinated. The king was attending a royal procession, a public ceremony. A man named Pausanias of Orestis, one of the royal bodyguards, stepped out from the crowd and stabbed the king. Philip fell. The king was dead. In that instant, everything changed. The Macedonian kingdom was suddenly without a leader. Many generals wanted power. Many foreign kingdoms saw an opportunity. It seemed possible that Macedon would fragment. It seemed possible that years of civil war would follow. The neighbouring city-states of Greece were preparing to rebel against Macedonian rule. But Alexander was 20 years old and he was quick. He moved with decisive speed. He secured the loyalty of the generals by promising them power and positions. He gathered the army. He made himself known as the new king. He eliminated rivals who might have challenged his authority. He personally led troops against the Greek city-states that were trying to rebel. He showed the world that even though he was young, he was not weak. He was not indecisive. He was his father's son, and perhaps even more formidable than his father had been. And then, having secured his position at home, Alexander turned his attention outward. He had a plan that was almost incomprehensible in its ambition. The Persian Empire was the greatest power in the world. It stretched from the Mediterranean Sea all the way to India. It had ruled for more than 2 centuries. Its kings had conquered and ruled vast territories, but the Persian Empire was showing signs of weakness. Its king, Darius III, was relatively weak. The generals were squabbling among themselves. There was internal political division. Alexander decided to conquer the Persian Empire. It sounds mad. It sounds impossible. At the time, most people thought it was impossible. How could a young Macedonian king, with an army of perhaps 40,000 soldiers, conquer an empire that had millions of soldiers? But Alexander had something that money could not buy. He had a clear vision. He had brilliant military strategy. He had absolute confidence in his army. And he had a gift for inspiring loyalty in his soldiers. They would follow him anywhere. They would risk anything for him. In 334 before the Common Era, Alexander crossed into Asia Minor with his army. His first battle came at a river called the Granicus. The Persians expected him to cross at a ford far upstream, where the crossing would be easier. But Alexander was unpredictable. He charged directly at the fortified position where the Persians thought they were safe. He led a cavalry charge across the river himself, directly at the Persian troops. His soldiers, seeing their king charging across a river into enemy fire, felt they had no choice but to follow. They charged too. The Persians broke. They fled. Alexander had his first victory. Word spread across the known world. The new king of Macedon was a military genius. The great powers took notice. The Greek city-states, which had been reluctant to accept Macedonian rule, began to see Alexander as a force that could not be resisted. He was not like his father. He was not just a regional power. He was something new. He was someone who might actually change the world. In 333 before the Common Era, Alexander faced the main Persian army at a place called Issus. Darius III himself was leading the Persian forces. The Persian army was much larger than Alexander's. The number of Persian soldiers is debated by historians, but most estimates suggest that Darius outnumbered Alexander by at least 2-1, perhaps by much more. But Alexander, as usual, did something unexpected. Instead of defending against the Persian attack, he attacked. He saw a weakness in the Persian formation. Darius was standing at the centre of his army, surrounded by his elite guards. Alexander led a cavalry charge directly at them. The Persian guards were the most sloshed soldiers in the world, but they had never faced cavalry charge tactics like Alexander's. They broke. They couldn't hold the line. Darius, seeing his personal guards being cut down, panicked. The king of the Persian Empire turned his horse and fled from the battlefield. His army, seeing their king running, lost heart. They began to flee too. In a single afternoon, the balance of power in the ancient world had shifted. Darius had escaped, but his army was broken. Alexander had won. The conquest accelerated. Alexander moved into Syria. He besieged the great city of Tyre, which was built on an island in the Mediterranean. The city was a major trading centre. Its walls were thick and strong. The people inside thought they were safe, protected by the sea. They believed that no army could reach them, but Alexander was patient and determined. For 7 months his army surrounded the city. His engineers built massive siege towers. They attacked from the sea using ships. The defenders of Tyre fought back desperately. They lost thousands of Alexander's soldiers, but eventually the walls were breached. The city fell. Thousands of people passed. Alexander made an example of Tyre. He wanted the world to know, cities that resist me will be destroyed, but cities that surrender will be treated fairly. This became his strategy. This threat hung over every city he approached. Surrender or face obliteration. It worked. City after city surrendered. Some offered resistance, but most chose to open their gates rather than face Alexander's wrath. By 332 before the Common Era, Alexander had marched into Egypt. The Egyptians, weary of Persian rule, welcomed him as liberator. They saw Alexander as their saviour, the man who would free them from Persian oppression. The priests of Egypt hailed him as the chosen one. They proclaimed him to be the son of the god Amun-Ra. This was an important moment. Alexander, who had been raised as a Greek, now began to think of himself as an Egyptian king as well. And he made a decision that would have enormous historical consequences. He decided to found a new city on the Mediterranean coast, where the Nile Delta met the sea. He wanted a city that would be his capital, a place that could serve as the centre of his empire, a place where Greek merchants could trade with merchants from all over the world, a place that would connect the Mediterranean world with the Middle East, with Persia, with India. According to ancient writers, Alexander dreamed a dream the night before he founded the city. He dreamed of the god Homer, who appeared to him and blessed the location. Or perhaps it was the god Amun-Ra who appeared. The ancient accounts contradict each other. But they all agree that Alexander felt guided by the gods to this particular place. The site was on a strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and a large lake. Ships from distant lands could reach it. The location was defensible. The land was fertile. It was perfect. Alexander named the city after himself, Alexandria. He sketched out the city himself. The ancient writers describe him as taking a piece of charcoal and drawing the streets on the ground. The city would have 2 main streets crossing at right angles, in the Greek fashion. One street was called the Canopic Way, running east to west. The other was called the Street of the Somma, running north to south. The name Soma would become important later because it means body in Greek. The city was founded in 332 before the Common Era, though some sources say 331. Either way, Alexandria was born. It would become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. It would grow to have a population of hundreds of thousands. It would be the centre of trade and learning for centuries, and eventually it would be the place where Alexander's body would come to rest. But that was in the future. For now, Alexander was focused on conquest. That same year, 331 before the Common Era, Alexander fought the battle that would decide the fate of the Persian Empire. At a place called Gaugamela, in what is now Iraq, Darius III assembled his final army. This was everything he had left. It was the largest military force ever assembled in the ancient world. Later estimates suggest it included over 1 million soldiers. It included war elephants, which were terrifying to soldiers who had never seen them before. It included cavalry and infantry and archers. It had every advantage of size and numbers. Alexander had perhaps 40,000 soldiers. He was outnumbered by more than 20 to 1. It should have been a devastation. It should have been a victory for Darius. But Alexander had something that couldn't be measured in numbers of soldiers. He had brilliant military insight. He saw the Persian formation, and he recognized its weakness. The Persian king, Darius, was positioned at the center of his army, surrounded by his royal guard. If Alexander could break through to Darius, if he could kill or capture the king, the entire Persian army would lose heart. They would break apart. So Alexander did what he always did. He attacked at the point of maximum danger. He led a cavalry charge straight at Darius himself. The Persian guards were the most elite warriors in the world, but they had never faced anything like Alexander. They had never faced a charge of Macedonian cavalry led by a king who was willing to die for victory. The Persian guards broke. They couldn't hold the line, and Darius, seeing his guards being lost, seeing passing approaching, did what humans do when they panic. He turned and ran. He turned his horse and fled from the battlefield, and when the king of the Persian Empire started running, his army lost the will to fight. They broke apart. They ran too. In a single afternoon, the greatest empire in the world was finished. Darius escaped to the east, but his power was broken. Alexander had won. He was now the king of Persia as well as the king of Macedon. The conquest continued. Alexander pushed deeper into Asia. He marched to Persepolis, the great capital of the Persian Empire. The palaces there were magnificent. The treasures were incredible. Alexander burned the palaces. He took the treasures. He proclaimed himself to be the legitimate successor of the Persian kings. He was no longer just a Macedonian conqueror. He was the emperor of Persia. His empire now stretched across the entire Middle East and Egypt. It stretched across more than 2 million square miles. But Alexander was not satisfied. He wanted to go further. He had read accounts of India. He had studied geography. He knew that beyond Persia lay more lands, more kingdoms, more territory to conquer. His army followed him deeper into Asia. They marched for years. They fought and conquered and marched and fought again. In 326 before the Common Era, after years of campaigning in Central Asia, Alexander's army reached the Hydaspes River in what is now Pakistan. There, they encountered a king named Porus who had a very large army. Porus had elephants which were trained for war. They were enormous creatures, and they were terrifying to soldiers who had never seen them before. They could carry warriors on their backs. They could use their trunks to strike soldiers. They could trample men to passing. The Battle of the Hydaspes was fierce. Alexander's cavalry charged the elephants, and at first the horses panicked. They had never seen such creatures. But Alexander was a brilliant military tactician. He regrouped his cavalry. He attacked from different angles. He surrounded the elephants and the men who were riding them. He forced them to retreat. Alexander won the battle. He defeated King Porus and incorporated his kingdom into his growing empire. And then, after this battle, something happened that shows us the depth of Alexander's character. Something that revealed that beneath the conqueror, beneath the military genius, there was a man capable of deep feeling. His horse passed. This was not just any horse. This was Bucephalus, the horse Alexander had tamed when he was a boy. According to the ancient story, which was preserved by the historian Plutarch, young Alexander had seen Bucephalus in his father's stable. The horse was wild and uncontrollable. No one could ride it. The handlers couldn't get near it. But the young Alexander noticed something. The horse was afraid of its own shadow. When the handlers tried to ride it, the shadow beneath the horse was jumping and moving, and that terrified the animal. But Alexander realized something that other people had not. He realized that if he could take the horse toward the sun so that the shadow was behind the animal instead of beneath it, the horse might calm down. He got on Bucephalus's back and turned the horse toward the sun, and the horse obeyed. From that moment, Alexander and Bucephalus were inseparable. The horse had become his friend, his companion, the animal he trusted absolutely. When Bucephalus passed after the Battle of the Hydaspes, Alexander grieved deeply. He didn't just mourn a horse, he honoured it. He founded an entire city in memory of Bucephalus. He named it Alexandria Bucephala. He wanted the world to remember that this horse had carried him to every victory, had been loyal to him, had passed in service to his vision. It was a gesture that seemed strange to some of his generals. Why mourn a horse when you have just won a great victory? Why found a city for an animal? But it revealed something important about Alexander. He loved fiercely. He honoured loyalty. He remembered those who served him. He was capable of deep compassion, as well as ruthless military strategy. After the Hydaspes, Alexander wanted to continue deeper into India, but his army refused. They had been fighting for years. They had marched thousands of miles. They were exhausted. They were far from home. They wanted to return to Macedon. They wanted to rest. They wanted to see their families again. Even Alexander the Great couldn't force them to continue. A successful general must listen to his soldiers. Alexander recognized this. He turned back. He began the long journey home. It was around 327 before the Common Era. During his 13 years of conquest, Alexander had founded more than 70 cities. Many of them were named Alexandria, after himself. Some were named Alexandria Bucephala, in memory of his horse. He had conquered more territory than any man in history. He ruled an empire that stretched from Greece to northwestern India. His name was known everywhere. He was perhaps the most famous man in the world. When he finally reached Babylon again, in 323 before the Common Era, he was tired. He was perhaps 32 years old. That doesn't sound old to us, but in the ancient world, it was not young. He had lived an intense life. He had spent every year since he was 20 years old at war. He had endured hardships that would have broken ordinary men. He had seen things that no human should see. The physical and emotional toll was accumulating. Alexander entered Babylon as its king. He chose it as the new capital of his empire. He wanted to rule from there. He made plans for new campaigns. He made plans to continue his conquests. He was still ambitious. He still wanted more. But his body was failing him, even if he didn't fully realize it. It was early June, 323 before the Common Era. Alexander attended a banquet hosted by a man named Medius of Larissa. The banquet was to celebrate recent military victories and to enjoy a night of leisure. Alexander had invited his admiral Nearchus to the banquet. Nearchus had just returned from a long voyage exploring the coast of the Persian Gulf. There was much to celebrate. The wine flowed freely. The food was abundant. Musicians played. Dancers performed. Alexander was the centre of attention. Everyone wanted to honour him, to be in his presence, to bask in his glory. He was the most powerful man in the world. The future seemed unlimited. But at some point during the night, something went wrong. Alexander became ill. Whether it was something he ate or something he drank, whether it was a sudden attack of disease or something more gradual, the ancient writers don't tell us. But he developed a fever. His body temperature rose. He began to feel unwell. The banquet ended. Alexander retired to the palace. The royal physicians were called. They examined him. They tried remedies. They applied cool cloths to his forehead. They gave him medicines. But the fever didn't break. Throughout that night and the next day it continued. The fever was high. It was persistent. It was dangerous. 10 days passed. 14 days passed. The ancient sources, which were kept by the royal secretaries in a diary called the Royal Ephemerides, recorded what was happening day by day. The fever continued. Alexander experienced chills and sweats and exhaustion. His mind sometimes wandered. Sometimes he seemed delirious. Other times he was lucid. The royal physicians tried everything they knew, but nothing worked, and as the days passed, the fever consumed his strength. His great body, which had endured years of warfare and hardship, began to fail. The man who had conquered empires was losing a battle against an invisible enemy. On June 10th or June 11th, 323 before the Common Era, Alexander the Great passed. He was 32 years old. He had reigned for 13 years. He had conquered an empire that stretched across more than 2 million square miles. He had founded more than 70 cities. His name would be remembered forever. But his body was still in Babylon. His empire was leaderless. His generals immediately began to fight over who would succeed him. What lost Alexander? It's one of the great unsolved mysteries of history. Scholars have debated for more than 2,000 years. The ancient accounts describe fever and chills and exhaustion, but they don't give us enough information to be certain of the cause. The University of Maryland School of Medicine analysed the ancient evidence in 1998 and concluded that Alexander most likely passed of typhoid fever. Typhoid is a bacterial infection spread through contaminated water or food. It causes high fever and weakness, and it can be fatal if not treated. The symptoms match what the ancient writers described. Other scholars have argued for malaria, a parasitic infection carried by mosquitoes. Malaria is common in tropical regions like Babylon. The royal ephemerides describe a fever that came and went in waves, which is consistent with malaria. Malaria can be fatal. Some medical historians have proposed West Nile virus encephalitis, an infection that attacks the brain. Others have suggested acute pancreatitis, caused by Alexander's years of heavy drinking. These diseases could also produce the symptoms described. But one scholar's theory is especially interesting. In 2019, a medical historian named Dr. Catherine Hall published a paper proposing that Alexander had Guillain-Barré syndrome, or GBS. This is an autoimmune disease in which the body's immune system attacks the peripheral nervous system. It causes progressive muscle paralysis, starting in the legs and moving upward. In severe cases, the muscles that control breathing become paralyzed. What's intriguing about Dr. Hall's theory is that it explains something the ancient writers found mysterious. Multiple sources, including Plutarch and Curtius Rufus, mention that Alexander's body did not show signs of decay. This is remarkable. Babylon is hot. The climate would promote rapid decomposition. But the ancient writers describe the body as remaining uncorrupted for 6 days or more. They interpreted this as a sign of divinity, a sign that Alexander was a god. But Dr. Hall proposed a different explanation. If Alexander had severe GBS, the paralysis would eventually prevent him from breathing. He might be declared gone when he was actually still alive, his brain still functioning, but his body completely paralyzed. His metabolism would be slowed by the paralysis. His body temperature would drop. In this state, with his metabolism extremely slow, decomposition would be dramatically delayed. The body would look preserved because the natural processes of decay would be slowed by the low metabolic rate. This theory suggests that Alexander might have been alive for hours, perhaps even days after he was declared dead. He might have been conscious, he might have been aware of what was happening around him, but he would have been completely unable to move or speak or breathe on his own. It's a terrifying possibility. A man trapped in his own body, unable to tell anyone that he was still there. But whether it was typhoid or malaria or West Nile virus or Guillain-Barré syndrome, one thing is certain. Alexander was fading, and as he lay in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon, surrounded by his generals and physicians, he knew the end was near. His last words have been debated for 2,000 years. Some sources quote him as saying, "to the strongest," using the Greek word kratisto. It was his way of saying that his empire should go to whichever of his generals was the strongest. It was a way of acknowledging that he had no clear successor, that the empire would be divided among his most powerful generals. But other sources claim that his words were misheard. Perhaps the fever had affected his ability to speak clearly. Perhaps his generals misunderstood his fading words. Some accounts claim he said, "to Craterius," the name of one of his generals. Others claim he said nothing intelligible at all. Whatever his last words were, one thing is clear. As Alexander lay fading, his regent, a general named Perdiccas, was by his side, and in his final moment of consciousness, Alexander performed one last act of authority. He reached out his hand and gave Perdiccas his signet ring. The signet ring was a small cylinder of stone or metal bearing the royal seal. Whoever held the signet ring had the authority to rule in the name of the king. Alexander was transferring his power, his authority, his right to rule to Perdiccas. Perdiccas took the ring. He held it in his hand. From that moment, even though Alexander IV, Alexander's unborn son was the nominal heir. Perdiccas was the actual ruler of the empire, and in that instant, the unity of Alexander's empire passed with him. Perdiccas would not rule for long, but for the moment he held the power. He held the signet ring, and the question of what to do with Alexander's body became one of the most important political questions of the age. But first, there had to be a funeral, and that funeral would be like nothing the ancient world had ever seen. It would be the most expensive, the most elaborate, the most magnificent funeral ever held. It would require 2 years to build. It would require an engineer of genius to design. It would be a moving temple, a travelling palace for a gone king. And it would set in motion the events that would eventually lead to one of the greatest mysteries in human history. The construction of the funeral carriage, the catafalque, began in Babylon in 323 before the Common Era. A brilliant engineer named Aridaeus was put in charge of the project. He was given unlimited resources. Money was no object. Time was no object. He was asked to create something worthy of the greatest man who had ever lived. For 2 years, workers laboured. They cut wood and shaped it. They applied gold leaf to Ionic columns, the architectural style favoured by the Greeks. The carriage would be 6 metres long and 4 metres wide, with walls of gold-covered columns. Purple curtains, embroidered with gold thread, would drape the interior. These curtains were made from Phoenician dye, the most expensive purple dye in the ancient world. The colour purple was so valuable that it was reserved for kings and emperors. Every thread in those curtains represented hours of labour and enormous expense. The carriage would be decorated with paintings depicting Alexander's greatest victories. His cavalry charges would be immortalised in paint. His sieges would be captured in detail. Generals and soldiers would be shown in heroic poses. Elephants and armies and naval battles would be rendered in elaborate artistic scenes. A golden sceptre would be painted into Alexander's hand. He would be shown surrounded by his officers, his companions, his army. Golden lions, each the size of a real lion, would guard the entrance to the structure. At each of the 4 corners, Nike statues would stand, representing victory. These were not small decorations. They were enormous, perhaps 2 meters tall, positioned to be seen from great distances away. At all 4 corners, stone trapeians, monuments commemorating military victory, would be constructed. Inside this enormous structure, at the very centre, a golden sarcophagus would be placed, and inside the sarcophagus, a coffin made of hammered gold. Alexander's body would rest inside the coffin of gold. The carriage itself would not move under its own power. It would be pulled by 64 mules, each decorated with gilded crowns. The crowns were not light ornaments, they were heavy, made of solid gold. Each mule would wear gold bells around its neck and body. As the carriage moved, the bells would ring. The sound would be audible from a great distance away. The approach of the funeral carriage would be announced not by trumpet or drum, but by the constant ringing of gold bells, carried by mules that were themselves adorned with gold. According to the ancient historian Diodorus Siculus, who preserved detailed descriptions of the carriage, the whole structure weighed over 100 tons. It was the largest hearse ever built. Its cost was beyond calculation. It was, Diodorus wrote, a work that surpassed all others in cost and was famed for the excellence of its workmanship. When the carriage was finally complete, in 321 before the Common Era, it was ready to begin its journey. Alexander's body, placed in the golden coffin, rested inside the golden sarcophagus, rested inside the carriage, surrounded by all this wealth and gold and artistic grandeur. The funeral procession was to begin. The planned route was clear. The carriage would travel from Babylon through Damascus, through the lands of Phoenicia, and into the region of Syria. From there, it would continue north into Anatolia, and eventually reach the port cities of the Mediterranean. From those ports, the body would be shipped by sea to Pella, in Macedon, where Alexander's father Philip was buried. There, in the royal burial grounds of Macedon, Alexander would be interred. He would rest alongside his father. He would return home to the land where he was born. The procession began. The 64 mules with their golden crowns and gold bells began to pull the enormous carriage. Behind them came soldiers, generals, priests, and mourners. Thousands of people walked in the funeral procession. It was the most impressive display the ancient world had ever seen. But something extraordinary was about to happen. something that would change the fate of Alexander's remains, something that would set in motion the great mystery that has lasted for more than 2,300 years. As the funeral procession moved south and west from Babylon, heading toward Damascus, a message came, a signal, a prearranged communication. The engineer Aridaeus, who was guiding the carriage, recognized it immediately. He understood what was being asked of him. He understood that a plan had been made, a plan to intercept the funeral carriage, a plan to steal the body of Alexander the Great. And without hesitation, without visible resistance, Aridaeus changed direction. Instead of continuing north toward Macedon, the carriage turned south. Instead of heading toward the Mediterranean coast, it headed toward Egypt. The funeral procession changed course, carrying Alexander's body not toward his father's tomb, but toward the land of the Nile. The person responsible for this extraordinary theft was Ptolemy. Ptolemy had once studied with Alexander under Aristotle's tutelage at the Temple of the Nymphs. Ptolemy had been Alexander's general. After Alexander's passing, Ptolemy had been appointed governor of Egypt by the regents. And now, in 321 before the Common Era, Ptolemy made a decision that would change the course of history. Why would Ptolemy do such a thing? Why would he risk war by stealing the body of the king? The answer is political. Ptolemy understood something about power in the ancient world. In the mind of ancient people, possession of the body of a great man conferred legitimacy. If you possessed the remains of the greatest man who had ever lived, if you were the guardian of his tomb, if you were the keeper of his memory, then your authority was unquestionable. The people would support you. The world would accept your rule. You would be blessed by association with greatness. Ptolemy was strong, but Egypt was not yet fully his. He had been appointed governor, but there were other governors, other rulers, other powerful men who might challenge his authority. But if Ptolemy could claim that he was the guardian of Alexander, the protector of the greatest man who had ever lived, then his authority would become absolute. Egypt would be his, and he would build something that would last. When Perdiccas, the regent holding Alexander's signet ring, learned of Ptolemy's theft, he was outraged. He led an army into Egypt to recover the body. He intended to fight Ptolemy, to defeat him militarily, to take back Alexander's remains. But Ptolemy's forces were too strong. Ptolemy had been living in Egypt, recruiting soldiers, building his military power. He was ready for Perdiccas. He defeated him in battle. Perdiccas was lost, and Ptolemy remained in control of Egypt. He had won. The body of Alexander was now his. The great conqueror would spend the rest of eternity not in his homeland of Macedon, but in Egypt, in the land of the Nile. The funeral carriage continued south, out of Syria, down into the desert, heading toward Egypt. The 64 mules pulled the enormous golden structure across the sand. The gold bells rang. The procession moved forward, carrying Alexander's body to a destination he had never intended. The carriage reached Egypt. It travelled along the Nile. Finally, it came to rest in Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt. Memphis had been sacred for more than 1,000 years. It was the site of the great Temple of Ptah, one of the oldest and most important temples in Egypt. Ptah was one of the oldest gods of Egypt. He was the god of creation and craftsmanship. He was revered for his wisdom and his power to create. Ptolemy chose this temple as the resting place for Alexander's body. It was an appropriate choice. The Temple of Ptah was one of the greatest temples in Egypt. Its walls were ancient. Its priests were learned. It was a place of power and reverence. The body was removed from the golden coffin and placed within the Temple of Ptah. Ptolemy came to the temple. He stood before the remains of his old friend and teacher. He placed his hand on the sarcophagus. He had done it. He had succeeded. Against all opposition, against the regent Perdiccas, against the expectations of the world, he had claimed the body of Alexander. And because he possessed Alexander, his rule in Egypt would be unquestionable. The people of Egypt would accept him as their rightful ruler. The world would see him as the chosen guardian of the greatest man who had ever lived. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which Ptolemy now founded, would rule Egypt for the next 300 years. It would be one of the longest and most stable dynasties in Mediterranean history, and it would all begin with this act of audacity, this theft of a corpse, this interception of a funeral carriage in the desert. Alexander's body would remain in Memphis for perhaps 50 years. It would rest in the Temple of Ptah, protected, preserved, honoured. But it was not Ptolemy's plan for Alexander to remain in Memphis forever. Ptolemy had larger plans. He was building a new capital. He was developing a new city. He was creating a center of power and culture that would rival any city in the Mediterranean world. And that city was Alexandria, the city that Alexander himself had founded, the city that would become famous for its great library, its lighthouse, its scholarship and learning. It was there that Alexander's body would eventually be moved. It was there that the great Somma, the royal mausoleum, would be built. It was there that hundreds of thousands of people would come, over the next 400 years, to stand before the body of the greatest conqueror who had ever lived. But that is a story for another night. For now, we have traced the life of Alexander from his birth on July 20th, 356 before the Common Era, in the palace at Pella, all the way to the moment when his body came to rest in the Temple of Ptah in Memphis, in the year 321 before the Common Era. We have followed him through his education with Aristotle, through his accession to the throne at age 20, through his magnificent conquests that took him from the Mediterranean to India. We have witnessed the banquet of Medius of Larissa, the fever that lasted 14 days, the passing of the greatest military genius the world has ever known. And we have seen how, even in passing, his body became an object of political struggle, how the possession of his remains determined the fate of empires, how a funeral carriage heading north was diverted south, changing the course of history. The mystery of Alexander's tomb has not yet truly begun. That mystery lies ahead of us. It lies in the story of how the tomb was visited for 400 years by kings and emperors and ordinary people. It lies in the story of how, between the time of the last visitor in 215 after the Common Era and the time of the church father John Chrysostom around 400 after the Common Era, the tomb simply vanished. No explanation, no account, no record, just silence. But for now, as you listen to the wind outside, as your breathing slows and deepens, as your eyes grow heavy, think about what we have heard tonight. Think about a child born in a Macedonian palace. Think about that child stufading in the gardens of Mysa with the greatest philosopher of his age. Think about that child growing up to become the most powerful man in the world. Think about him conquering empires, founding cities, reshaping the Mediterranean world in a way that would echo for 2,000 years. And think about the moment when it all came to an end, the fever that burned without mercy, the body that would not decay, the funeral carriage pulled by gold-crowned mules, the theft in the desert, the body carried away to a temple in Egypt, to a tomb that would be visited by Caesar and Augustus and Caligula and countless others. Think about that tomb waiting somewhere beneath the modern streets of Alexandria, waiting in tunnels no one has mapped, waiting in chambers sealed by sand and time, waiting in the darkness, holding the greatest secret of the ancient world. The story of Alexander's life is the story of a man who seemed almost superhuman in his abilities. He conquered every enemy he faced. He defeated every kingdom that stood against him. He built an empire faster than any man in history. But he could not conquer one enemy. He could not defeat the one thing that awaits all of us, no matter how great we are. He could not conquer passing, and the body that had carried him through 12,000 miles of conquest, that had led cavalry charges against armies 10 times his size, that had endured the heat of deserts and the cold of mountains, that body was now beyond all the power of the greatest mind ever born. It lay still, it was silent. The heart that had pumped crimson through endless years of campaigns had stopped. The mind that had conceived the conquest of the world was gone. The will that had bent empires to his vision was finished. What remained was simply a body, a physical form, something to be preserved, something to be honoured, something to be displayed. Ptolemy understood this. As he stood in the Temple of Ptah in Memphis, his hand resting on the sarcophagus containing his old friend, he understood what he held. Not just the body of a man, but a symbol of power, a symbol of legitimacy, a symbol of the divine. And that symbol would change everything. The body of Alexander would remain in Memphis under Ptolemy's care. The Temple of Ptah became a place of pilgrimage. People came from across the Mediterranean world to stand before the tomb. They came to see if what they had heard was true, if the great conqueror really was dead. They came to pay respects. They came to touch the sarcophagus and feel connected to greatness. 50 years would pass, perhaps more. The body remained preserved. The golden sarcophagus reflected the light of oil lamps. The temple priests maintained the tomb, and Ptolemy ruled Egypt, and his rule was strong and unquestionable because he possessed Alexander. But Ptolemy had a vision for something even greater. He was developing a plan to move the body, to take it from Memphis, this ancient city, and bring it to a new city, the city that Alexander himself had founded, the city that was becoming the center of Mediterranean trade and learning, Alexandria. And there, on the crossroads of two great streets, the Canopic Way and the Street of the Somma, Ptolemy would build a monument unlike any other in the ancient world, a royal mausoleum, a temple, a place where Alexander's body would be displayed for all to see, for all to honor, for all to remember. It would be called the Somma, the body. And for 400 years people would come to stand before it. Julius Caesar would weep before it. Augustus would place a golden wreath upon it. Caligula would remove the breastplate from it. Caracalla would remove his own tunic and ring and place them upon the sarcophagus in devotion. Septimius Severus would seal it, attempting to prevent further looting. And then, after Caracalla, after the year 215 after the Common Era, no one would come anymore. The visitors would stop, the pilgrims would cease, the records would go silent. And no one, not even the great church father John Chrysostom who walked the streets of Alexandria around the year 400, could tell anyone where the tomb was anymore. The greatest monument of the ancient world would simply vanish. But that mystery lies ahead. That is a mystery for future nights, when we will trace the slow disappearance of Alexander's remains, when we will follow the trail as it grows colder and colder, when we will approach the moment when the greatest conqueror ever to live became completely lost to history. For now, as you listen to the wind outside, as your breathing slows and deepens, as your eyes grow heavy, let your mind rest on the image of Memphis, the ancient city on the Nile, the temple of Ptah with its high walls and columns, the sarcophagus of gold, the body of the greatest man who ever lived resting in the silence of the temple. Imagine what it was like for Ptolemy to stand there, to look at his old friend, his teacher, his rival, to know that through the possession of this body his dynasty would flourish, that generations of kings bearing his name would rule Egypt, that his vision would shape the future of the Mediterranean world. He placed his hand on the sarcophagus. Perhaps he whispered something, a prayer, a promise, a goodbye. And in the darkness of the temple, in the flickering light of oil lamps, the body of Alexander the Great lay still, preserved, honored, waiting for the next chapter of its long and extraordinary journey. Think about the mysteries that lay ahead. Think about the 400 years of visitors. Think about the Somma in Alexandria, with its gold and purple and artistic grandeur. Think about Caesar weeping. Think about Augustus's careless hand breaking the nose of the great conqueror. Think about Caracalla making devotions to his hero. Think about Septimius Severus sealing the tomb to protect it from thieves. Think about the year 215 after the Common Era, when the last visitor came. After him, there was only silence, only questions, only the mystery that has endured for more than 2,300 years. But for now, let sleep take you. Let your mind drift back through time, back to the gardens of Mysa, back to the palace of Pella, back to the day when Alexander was born. Let the mystery settle around you like Egyptian sand. Let the story of the greatest conqueror and his lost tomb carry you down into sleep, into dreams of ancient empires and vanished monuments and the endless search for the lost body of a king. Tomorrow night we will follow him to Alexandria. We will stand before the Somma. We will welcome the visitors. We will witness the slow tragedy of how the greatest monument in human history was gradually forgotten. We will approach the moment when Alexander truly vanished, when the world stopped searching, when the tomb became an empty space filled only with questions. But for now, let sleep take you. Drift away, rest in the darkness. Sleep well, and tomorrow night, the deeper mystery awaits. From the moment Ptolemy seized Alexander's body during the funeral procession, he understood something profound. Possession of the conqueror's remains was power itself. But where to keep them? The great general had passed in Babylon, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II, on a June day in 323 BC, after just 12 days of fever that had ravaged his powerful frame. His body had been hidden away in Memphis, in the Temple of Ptah in Egypt, for nearly 50 years. Through all the wars of the Diadochi, the bitter conflicts between Alexander's generals as they tore his empire apart, Ptolemy had kept the body safe. Now, around the year 280 to 285 BC, with Egypt secure and his dynasty's future assured, Ptolemy II Philadelphus made the decision that would transform his city forever. The body would be moved from Memphis to Alexandria. Ptolemy II stood in the temple at Memphis and gazed upon the mummy of the man who had conquered his world. The body was almost perfectly preserved, a miracle of ancient Egyptian embalming techniques. The preserved features still retained something of the man, the sharp profile, the determined set of the jaw. Even in passing, a sense of authority seemed to emanate from the remains. Ptolemy II spoke to a priest standing beside him. He built Alexandria while alive. Now his remains will live at the heart of it. This is what immortality means. The priest bowed. He understood. This transfer was not merely practical. It was theological. It was political. It was everything. The journey was careful, controlled. The ancient sources don't record grand processions or public fanfare. What we know is that the mummy of Alexander was transported northward along the Nile in a state of solemn secrecy. The river itself seemed to welcome it home, where once the young king, barely 20, had dreamed his fateful dream of Amun-Ra, the Egyptian god, before laying out the plans for Alexandria in 332 BC. Now his physical form would enter through the same waters, carried on a barge draped in purple cloth and gold. The journey took weeks. At night the barge would be moored along the riverbank, guarded by priests and soldiers. During the day it moved steadily northward toward the delta. One of the priests attending the transport whispered to a younger colleague as they watched the mummy being secured, "Do you realize what we carry? This is not merely flesh and bone. This is the body of the man who conquered from Greece to India, the man who wept when he had no more worlds to conquer. And we, humble priests of the temple, are entrusted with his passage." The younger priest, awed, could only nod silently. This moment, they both understood, would be remembered, or perhaps forgotten entirely, but either way it mattered. It mattered profoundly. When Alexander's body arrived in Alexandria, the city was already transforming into something unprecedented in the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria was gathering the collected knowledge of the ancient world. Scroll upon scroll, manuscript upon manuscript, brought from every corner of the known world. Ships from Phoenicia, from Greece, from Egypt itself, from the distant ports of India, crowded the harbours, unloading their cargoes of papyrus and parchment, clay tablets and carved stones. The lighthouse of Pharos, the Pharos Tower, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, stood guard at the entrance to the harbour like a colossus. Its flame, lit each night by a carefully maintained system of mirrors and oil, was visible for 30 miles across the Mediterranean Sea. The mausoleum, that temple of the Muses founded by Ptolemy himself, buzzed with an electric energy of intellectual discourse. Philosophers debated the nature of the cosmos. Mathematicians worked out new proofs. Astronomers charted the movement of stars. The city itself had become the brain of the ancient world, a place where knowledge was gathered, preserved, transmitted, celebrated. And at the precise geographic centre of this intellectual and mercantile empire, at the crossroads of the Canopic Way and the street of the Somma, Ptolemy II made his decision about where to place his greatest treasure. This location was not chosen by accident. It was chosen because it was the heart. Every street in Alexandria led away from this point. Every path in the city originated here. The body of Alexander, the man who had brought the entire world under the dominion of a single vision, would rest at the exact centre of the city he had created. One merchant, arriving from Tyre and seeing the site for the first time, turned to a guide and asked, "Why here? Why precisely here?" The guide smiled at the innocence of the question. "Because," he said, "all roads lead to Alexander, even in passing, especially in passing." The Somma was built at the intersection of 2 grand avenues, the Canopic Way running east and west through the entire city, and the street of the Somma running north and south. Imagine standing at that crossroads around 280 BC as the building began to rise. Imagine watching the marble blocks being set in place, marble imported from Greece at enormous expense. Imagine the gleaming white walls emerging from the construction site, the roof beginning to take shape. The building rose above the surrounding structures, a gleaming monument visible from almost anywhere in the city. Sailors entering the harbour could see it. Travellers approaching from the inland desert could see it. The walls were of white marble, with columns in the Ionic order. The interior was a marvel of design, meant to inspire awe and humility in anyone who crossed the threshold. An architect overseeing the construction stood back and surveyed his work, then turned to a younger apprentice beside him. "Do you understand what we're building?" The apprentice shook his head. The architect gestured grandly at the rising structure. "We're building the house of eternity. Everything around this building will change. Empires will rise and fall. The very boundaries of the world will shift. But this structure, if we build it well, if we build it true, will endure, and at its heart will be the only man in history who truly changed the world." The apprentice absorbed this, understanding that he was part of something far larger than himself, part of immortality itself. At the centre of the finished Soma lay Alexander's sarcophagus, still containing the body of the king, preserved in the Egyptian manner, his face visible through a transparent enclosure that Ptolemy had commissioned. Some accounts suggest it was made of crystal. Other sources claim it was glass, specially crafted to be absolutely transparent. Later sources, drawing on earlier accounts now lost, proposed that it might have been alabaster, a semi-translucent stone that would allow the body to be seen without being subject to the corrosive effects of direct air exposure. For nearly a century, it remained Alexander's alone. The Soma belonged exclusively to the greatest of conquerors. The building became a pilgrimage destination, a place that travellers made journeys specifically to visit. A philosopher from Athens, after viewing the Soma, remarked to his companions, "I have seen the monuments of Egypt, the pyramids built by pharaohs, tombs of kings from dynasties stretching back millennia. But this surpasses them all. Because Alexander is not yet myth. He is recent. He is real. And his legacy is still being written every moment by the actions of his successors." His companion replied, "Then in 500 years, what will they say of him? If we feel this way now, when his body is only 2 centuries gone, imagine the reverence that will have accumulated by then." But around 215 BC, everything changed. Ptolemy IV Philopator ascended to the throne, and he made a fateful decision that would alter the meaning of the Soma fundamentally. He expanded the building. He opened it to the other Ptolemaic kings. He had his father, Ptolemy III Euergetes, moved inside. He had earlier queens and kings transferred to the interior. Now the building became not a shrine dedicated exclusively to Alexander, but a communal mausoleum for the entire royal dynasty. The body of Alexander now shared space with those who had merely tried to emulate him. A priest of the period, whose name has not survived in any historical record, stood in the expanded Soma and looked around at the crowded interior, all these royal corpses gathered together in passing as they had never been gathered in life. He turned to an older colleague and whispered, "Was this the intention? To have Alexander rest alone forever, or to incorporate him eventually into the family? To make him the first among many, or merely the greatest among many?" The older priest, who had tended the tomb for 30 years, shook his head slowly. "I do not know," he said, "but I can tell you this. Something precious has been lost. Not the body. The body is still here. But something else. Something that cannot be recovered." The younger priest understood. He was witnessing the beginning of the end. Though he could not have known it would take 2 more centuries for the end to fully arrive. The building itself became magnificent over the following centuries. The Ptolemies invested enormous wealth in maintaining and enhancing it. Visitors came from across the Mediterranean world specifically to glimpse the man who had conquered the known world. Plutarch visited and left awestruck. Philosophers came to meditate. Warriors came to understand warfare. Kings came to accept the burden of kingship. But prosperity is fragile, and empires are vulnerable to fortune's reversals. Around the time of Ptolemy IX or Ptolemy X, Egypt fell into a severe financial crisis. The kingdom's treasury was depleted by wars with external enemies and internal struggles for power. The Nile failed to flood properly for several years in a row, meaning harvests were poor and tax revenues collapsed. The empire that Ptolemy had built was beginning to fray. In this moment of desperation, the rulers of Egypt made a decision that seemed practical and necessary, though it would have appeared scandalous to earlier generations. The gold sarcophagus in which Alexander had been entombed was melted down. The precious metal was desperately needed for the state treasury. It had to be converted into currency, into military supplies, into the mundane necessities of keeping a kingdom afloat. In its place, a new sarcophagus was crafted. According to the historian Strabo, who wrote in the 1st century AD and drew on earlier sources now lost to us, this new sarcophagus was made of glass or crystal. Strabo's words have echoed through 2,000 years. Not in the same sarcophagus as before, for the present one is made of glass, whereas the one wherein Ptolemy laid it was made of gold. Whether Strabo meant true glass, the kind used in windows, or a form of crystal, remains debated. The practical problem with glass is that it becomes cloudy over time when in contact with the preserved body and its ancient oils. Yet later accounts, from sources we can no longer fully identify, but which drew on contemporary records, suggest the glass was eventually replaced with alabaster, a translucent stone nearly as beautiful as crystal and considerably more durable. Alabaster would have allowed the body to be seen, while protecting it from air and the corrosive effects of direct exposure. A treasury official overseeing the melting of the ancient gold spoke to his superior. "Are we certain this is wise? This metal has been untouched for 3 centuries. It carries history." His superior, a man made hard by years of financial difficulty, replied, "History does not feed soldiers. Gold does, and this gold will. As for the body, glass serves as well as gold for display. Perhaps better. Gold blinds with its shine. Glass reveals. Perhaps that is more fitting for a body meant to be observed." Yet the Soma endured through all the changes, through Ptolemaic rule, through the wars that shook the Mediterranean basin, through the slow decline of Ptolemaic power. As Roman strength inexorably grew, the tomb remained. And when Rome finally conquered Egypt, when the last of the Ptolemies fell, the Soma did not lose its significance. It gained new significance. If anything, it became even more powerful, because now it represented something impossible to recover. The world before Rome's dominion, the world of equals competing for glory, the world where a single extraordinary man could reshape all of civilization through brilliance and will. The Soma became one of the great destinations of the Mediterranean world. Emperors travelled to Alexandria specifically to visit it. Kings made pilgrimage to stand before the body. Philosophers came to meditate in its chambers, seeking wisdom through proximity to greatness. Warriors arrived seeking to understand how a man barely older than themselves had conquered an empire stretching from Greece to India. The Soma became not just a tomb, but a shrine. Not a shrine to a god, though some whispered prayers to Alexander as though he were divine, but a shrine to the idea of Alexander himself, to human potential at its absolute maximum, to the possibility of transcendence. The first emperor to visit was Julius Caesar. In 48 BC, Caesar had been pursuing his enemy Pompey across the Roman world, their civil war tearing apart the republic that Caesar claimed to defend. The chase led him to Egypt, and there, in Alexandria, he entered the Soma. We know of this visit through the writings of the historian Suetonius, who recorded something that has endured for nearly 2,000 years. When Caesar stood before Alexander's body, he wept. A man of extraordinary power, a general who had conquered all of Gaul, who had crossed the Rubicon and challenged Rome itself, looked upon the preserved remains of the Macedonian king and felt the weight of comparison bearing down upon his shoulders like a physical force. Caesar was a man accustomed to victory. He had defeated his enemies. He had outwitted his political rivals. He had demonstrated courage and strategic brilliance throughout his military campaigns. And yet, standing in the Soma, confronted by the body of Alexander, he found himself overcome with emotion. "Do you not think it is matter for sorrow?" Caesar asked those standing nearby, his voice thick with feeling. "That while Alexander, at my age, was already king of so many peoples, I have as yet achieved no brilliant success." His attendants said nothing. They understood what their general had just admitted. At 32, Caesar was measuring himself against Alexander and finding himself diminished by the comparison. Caesar was 32 years old. Alexander had been 32 when he passed in Babylon, fever claiming him after a reign of just 13 years. At the precise same age, Caesar found himself having conquered less of the known world, having ruled for a shorter time, having left a smaller immediate mark on history than his ancient predecessor, despite all his victories. The emotion was genuine, unforced. For a moment, the mighty Caesar was reduced to a weeping visitor in a tomb, confronting human limitation in the presence of human transcendence. One of Caesar's companions recorded his reaction privately. I have never seen the general in such a state. It was as though he was looking not at a mummy, but at his own future, and found it less bright than he wished. And while Caesar stood in the Soma, something else momentous was happening in Alexandria. He was meeting Cleopatra VII, the final Ptolemaic queen, the last of the Macedonian dynasty that Ptolemy had founded. Their affair would reshape the history of Egypt and the Mediterranean for generations to come. But in the tomb, before all else, before politics and power calculations, Caesar could only weep at the shadow of Alexander's magnitude casting itself across the centuries. Later, Cleopatra would approach Caesar in the tomb, and they would stand together before Alexander's body. She whispered to him, gesturing toward the sarcophagus, "He is what I have always aspired to be, a ruler whose name will echo through all the ages of the world, not forgotten, not diminished by time. Alexander transcends even passing." Caesar, still holding the image of Alexander's preserved face in his mind, nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "He is the measure by which all of us are judged, and all of us are found wanting. The question is not whether we can match him. That is impossible. The question is whether we can live knowing that we never will." 80 years later, in 30 BC, another emperor arrived at the Soma. This was Octavian, later to be called Augustus, who had defeated Cleopatra and Marcus Antonius at the Battle of Actium, who had brought the long Mediterranean wars to an end through military superiority and political maneuvering. When Octavian entered Alexandria as its conqueror, when the city had finally bowed before Rome's inevitable dominance, one of his very first acts was to visit Alexander's tomb. Unlike Caesar's emotional display, Octavian came prepared with the ritualistic gift of a conqueror. He placed a golden crown upon Alexander's sarcophagus. He scattered flowers around the body, roses and lilies imported from the gardens of the Nile. He came not as a supplicant seeking wisdom or forgiveness, but as the new master of Egypt, as the man who had inherited by conquest what the Ptolemies had held by inheritance. As he paid his respects, he was simultaneously and officially transforming Egypt from an independent Ptolemaic kingdom into a Roman province. The light of Ptolemaic rule was extinguishing. Rome's imperium was rising to fill the space it left behind. But something happened in that tomb, something that would become famous in the historical record for 2,000 years. As Octavian leaned forward, as he made his offering of crown and flowers, as he gazed upon the face of the man who had shaped all of history, his hand brushed against the sarcophagus. He reached out, perhaps reverently, perhaps to feel the weight of the container, to confirm that Alexander was truly there. His hand made contact, and in that moment, according to the historian Cassius Dio, a small piece of Alexander's nose was broken off. A portion of the preserved face, fragile after 500 years of preservation, crumbled at the touch. The room fell silent. Octavian's attendants froze. Had they just witnessed desecration? Had Rome's new master just damaged the remains of Alexander the Great, the man upon whose legacy Rome had in many ways been built? Octavian himself seemed uncertain. He stepped back from the sarcophagus, observing the damage he had caused. Was it deliberate? Historians have debated this for 2 millennia. Some sources suggest it was a deliberate act of vandalism, a statement that Octavian was claiming dominion over even Alexander's remains, that nothing was sacred when Rome wanted to assert its power. Others maintain it was a genuine accident, the most delicate of contacts with something far too fragile to withstand a human touch, preserved for 5 centuries but still vulnerable to the weight of hope and reverence that visitors placed upon it. One historian theorized, perhaps Octavian wished to break it, perhaps he simply wished to touch it. The truth, like so much of history, remains hidden. When Octavian was asked afterward whether he wished to view the tombs of the other Ptolemaic kings, those numerous rulers who had followed Alexander and tried to emulate his legacy, he refused with a statement that has become famous. "I came to see a king, not corpses," he declared. The distinction he drew was profound and deliberate. To Octavian's mind, there was only one king worthy of vision in that city, only one body that deserved reverence, only one man whose name transcended the centuries and the dynasties that came after him. The rest, all the Ptolemies, all the pharaohs who had tried to match Alexander's legacy and fallen short, were merely corpses, bodies, failures. They had tried to be like Alexander, and they had failed, and therefore they were beneath notice. Only the original was worth seeing. Only the master was worth honouring. Centuries passed like waves, each one bringing change and transformation. Rome's dominion over Egypt deepened and solidified. The empire itself transformed, expanding and contracting, surviving crisis after crisis. The Soma remained the heart of Alexandria, still drawing visitors from across the Mediterranean and beyond, still holding the body of the conqueror. And emperors continued to come, one after another, century after century. Around the year 40 AD, the mad Emperor Caligula arrived in Egypt. Caligula was a man of extraordinary ambitions and equally extraordinary delusions about his own nature and destiny. He fancied himself a reincarnation of divine figures. He demanded to be worshipped not merely as the leader of Rome, but as a god. He commissioned monuments to himself, statues of himself, paintings celebrating his own power, as though he was attempting to create his own immortality through the sheer force of his will. And when he travelled to Alexandria, he was drawn, as all visitors were, to the Soma. The tomb had become a kind of magnet, pulling toward it anyone with power, anyone with ambition, anyone who wanted to understand what it meant to reshape the world. But Caligula did not come merely to pay respects in the manner of previous visitors. He came to acquire something for himself. The story, recorded in the writings of Suetonius and other historians, is almost too strange to believe, yet too consistent across multiple sources to dismiss entirely. Caligula allegedly entered the Soma and removed Alexander's breastplate from the sarcophagus. This was not a simple theft motivated by greed for gold or desire for a historical relic. This was the garment of the greatest warrior king of antiquity, the armour worn during the very conquest that had shaken the world, that had brought vast territories under a single man's dominion. Caligula wanted to wear it. He wanted to feel the power of Alexander's legacy upon his own body. He wanted to embody Alexander. He wanted to become Alexander, or at least to feel that he was. When he returned to Rome, according to some accounts, Caligula actually wore the breastplate publicly, processing through the city as though he himself was the reincarnation of Macedonian power, the new conqueror, the new master of the world. A priest who witnessed this removal of the breastplate would have been appalled, horrified at the violation of the sacred space. One chronicler, whose words echo through time with the weight of his indignation, described the reaction. The breastplate that protected the greatest king now adorns a madman. What profanity has befallen our shrine? Does Caesar not understand that Alexander's power lies not in cloth and metal, not in fabric and bronze, but in the immortality of his name? The name endures, the body persists, but the objects around it are mere things, and yet to see them handled by a man so clearly unworthy of touching them, it breaks something in the heart. Whether Caligula actually wore the breastplate through Rome's streets in public procession, or whether this is a later embellishment of history invented by those who wish to criticize Caligula's madness, we cannot be entirely certain. But the story persisted across centuries, and it spoke to a terrible truth. The Soma and its contents were now vulnerable to those who would exploit them, to those who would take pieces of it, to those who understood that proximity to Alexander's power could enhance their own claims to authority. Other emperors came and went through the decades and centuries. Nero was rumoured to have visited Alexandria during his reign, though the historical record remains silent on the specifics, leaving us to wonder if he ever stood before Alexander's body and what he might have felt there. A later emperor, Hadrian, the great builder and Hellenophile, who travelled throughout the empire in the early 2nd century AD, was said to have come to Alexandria with particular reverence. Hadrian was famously obsessed with Greek culture, with preserving the achievements of the Hellenic world. He wept at Achilles' tomb during his travels through Asia Minor. He loved Athens as much as Rome. He studied under philosophers. He considered himself a student of Greek excellence. When he arrived at the Soma, he would have understood, as all educated Romans did, that he was standing before the greatest monument to Greek ambition ever constructed, the tangible proof that a single man could reshape the world. An attendant who accompanied Hadrian on his visit to the tomb recalled the scene in a letter. The emperor spent hours in contemplation. He asked the priest to tell him everything about Alexander's conquests, about the body's preservation, about the sarcophagus. He wanted to know every detail. He ran his hands over the surface of the container, careful not to touch the body itself, but wanting to feel the physical reality of the tomb. When he finally departed, he was a different man, quieter, more thoughtful. It was as though he had received some kind of wisdom from standing before that body. Whether this account is historically precise or slightly embellished, we cannot know, but it captures the sense of awe and reverence that the Somma continued to inspire, even after 3 centuries of Roman rule. For over 400 years, the tomb remained accessible to visitors. For over 400 years, emperors and philosophers, soldiers and scholars from every corner of the known world came to Alexandria specifically to stand before Alexander's preserved body. The Somma was one of the wonders of the ancient world, rivaling even the library for the attention of visitors, rivaling the lighthouse and the great temples of Serapis. Young men came hoping to find inspiration for military careers. Philosophers came hoping to understand how a man could achieve so much in so brief a time. Kings came to accept their own limitations. The wealthy came to contemplate mortality. But in the late 2nd century AD, something began to change. Something dark and transformative was beginning to stir in the Mediterranean world. The age of pagan certainty was ending. The age of Christian dominance was beginning to dawn. In the year 200 AD, the Emperor Septimius Severus arrived in Alexandria. Severus was a military commander of the absolute first rank, a man who had seized power through military prowess and maintained it through ruthlessness and strategic brilliance. Unlike previous emperors who visited as pious admirers, Severus came to Alexandria not as a supplicant or a visitor, but as a conqueror. The city had supported his rivals during the civil wars that had brought him to power, and he was here to assert his dominance, to remind the citizens who was now in charge. According to the historical accounts that have survived to us, Severus visited the Somma and made an extraordinary decision that would change everything. He brought sacred texts with him, religious writings, perhaps scrolls of mystical significance or magical power. He placed these texts inside the sarcophagus itself, alongside Alexander's body, as though trying to merge the power of the ancient texts with the power of the ancient king. And then he did something unprecedented in 4 centuries of visitation. He ordered that the tomb be sealed. The implications were absolutely staggering, seismic in their importance. Severus issued a formal command that no one else should enter the tomb. No one else should view the body. The Somma, which for 4 centuries had stood as an open shrine welcoming visitors from across the entire known world, was closed. The greatest monument of the Hellenistic world was sealed by Rome. The emperor who had visited the greatest shrine of antiquity had hidden it away. Historians have debated his motivations for nearly 2,000 years, and still no consensus has been reached. Perhaps he was concerned that the sight of Alexander's body, so perfectly preserved despite the centuries, would inspire rebellion or fantasy or false hopes among the people. Perhaps he believed that the tomb should be sealed as a mark of ultimate respect, a way of protecting Alexander's remains from further degradation or theft by those who would exploit them as Caligula had. Perhaps he was responding to rising Christian influences in Alexandria that viewed pagan shrines with horror as abominations and wanted to protect the shrine by hiding it. Perhaps Severus had occult reasons we will never understand. Whatever his reasoning, Severus's decision marked a turning point in the history of the tomb, a pivot moment from which there was no return. A chronicler of the 3rd century, reflecting on Severus's action, wrote with a sense of profound loss. The emperor came seeking a king, and finding him he chose to hide him. Is this protection or destruction? Does sealing the tomb preserve Alexander's legacy, or does it ensure that his light will fade forever from human sight? To close the door is to begin forgetting, and once forgetting begins, can it ever be stopped? The question hung unanswered in the Somma's darkness, echoing in the sealed chambers like a ghost. Yet the tomb was not sealed forever. The seal would not hold. 15 years later, in 215 AD, another emperor came to Alexandria. This was Caracalla, the son of Severus, a man whose name is remembered in history as a byword for cruelty and excess and instability. Caracalla was unlike his father in temperament. Where Severus had been calculating and precise, Caracalla was volatile and impulsive. Where Severus had sealed the tomb with ritualistic purpose, Caracalla would open it with the recklessness of youth and obsession. Caracalla had travelled through the Mediterranean seeking to relive Alexander's conquests, attempting to walk the path that Alexander had walked. He emulated Alexander in dress and manner, wearing similar armour, adopting similar military tactics. He commissioned himself to be portrayed in coins and sculptures as the new Alexander, as Alexander reborn. He even claimed to receive visions that the great conqueror appeared to him in dreams, offering guidance from beyond passing. When Caracalla arrived in Alexandria, when he made his way to the Soma, he was not coming as a mere visitor or a casual tourist. He was coming as the spiritual successor to Alexander himself, as the one chosen to carry forward Alexander's legacy. Caracalla overrode his father's sealing order. He demanded that the Soma be opened. He had the seals broken. He entered the chamber where Alexander had lain undisturbed for over 500 years. He passed through the threshold into the darkness, and there, before the sarcophagus of the ancient king, before the body of the man he had always wanted to be, Caracalla performed an action that would become the last recorded visitation to the tomb in the ancient world. The chronicler John of Antioch, a medieval Byzantine historian who drew on earlier sources now lost to us but still available to him in his own time, recorded Caracalla's act in remarkable and moving detail. The emperor removed his own tunic, his ring and belt, along with other precious items, and deposited them on the coffin. He removed the symbols of his own power and laid them as offerings before Alexander. He offered himself as a supplicant before his hero, seeking in the mummy's preserved face a glimpse of his own destiny. He wept. He called out to Alexander by name, as though expecting the gone king to hear his voice through the centuries and offer wisdom from the grave. What Caracalla was doing in that moment was making an offering of himself. He was stripping away his imperial regalia, the symbols of his power as Emperor of Rome, the tokens that marked him as the ruler of the entire Mediterranean world. He was laying them upon Alexander's sarcophagus like a pilgrim leaving offerings at a shrine. In that moment he was acknowledging a truth that had been recognized for 4 centuries by every visitor before him, that Alexander's power transcended empire, transcended time, transcended even the grandest authority that Rome could bestow. A man who ruled over all Rome, who controlled the fate of millions, was humbling himself before the remains of a man who had ruled over 1400 years before. An attendant stood at the entrance of the chamber, watching this extraordinary scene play out before him, and later would record his impressions in a private letter. Never have I witnessed an emperor in such a state of awe. The mighty Caracalla, who had commanded legions, who had defeated enemies in battle, who had sentenced generals at his whim for the slightest disobedience, now stood as a child before an idol, weeping and trembling. It was as though the presence of Alexander's remains had drained him of all his power, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, mortal. He was no longer the master of the world. He was simply a man confronting greatness. I wondered if he would ever recover from what he was experiencing in that moment. I wondered if he would ever be the same man again. When Caracalla departed the Soma, when he finally emerged from the chamber where Alexander lay, he ordered the tomb sealed once more, but he also issued commands regarding how the citizens of Alexandria were to be treated. The historical accounts diverge at this point. Some sources claim that Caracalla, in his emotional state after visiting the tomb, ordered a mass action of the city's youth, a purge, devastating thousands of Alexandrians in a fit of rage or madness or divine inspiration. Other sources suggest this violence was exaggerated, that the violence, while severe, was less extensive than legend later claimed, that it was limited to political enemies and rival factions. But all sources agree on this fundamental point. Caracalla left Alexandria in a state of profound disturbance, having visited Alexander's tomb and emerged fundamentally changed. The man who entered the Soma was not the same man who left it. After 215 AD, there is silence. Complete, total, almost unbearable silence. No more recorded visits by emperors or generals. No more documented visitations by philosophers or scholars or seekers of wisdom. No more historians recording the experiences of those who made the pilgrimage to the Soma. The tomb, which had been one of the wonders of the ancient Mediterranean world for 400 unbroken years of visitation, entered into a fog. A darkness began to descend over it, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The great light was beginning to fade. The beacon that had guided visitors for centuries was being extinguished. The most famous monument in the ancient world was beginning its transformation into legend, into myth, into forgetting. We know from the writings of a few later sources that the tomb was still standing in the late 4th century AD. Around the year 390 AD, The rhetorician Libanius made a reference to Alexandria, where the corpse of Alexander is displayed, suggesting that at that time the body was still visible, still on display, still viewable to those who knew where to look. But Libanius, when discussing Alexandria and its wonders, when cataloguing the great monuments of antiquity, John posed a question that carried an implicit admission of mystery. Tell me, where is the tomb of Alexander? His tomb even his own people know not. These words, preserved in John's writings, carry an almost unbearable weight of meaning. They suggest that within the space of just 10 years or so, from Libanius's observation in 390 AD to John's statement around 400 AD, the knowledge of where Alexander's body lay had been lost. Not the body itself, necessarily, but the knowledge. The location had become unknown. The information had been forgotten. It was as though the greatest monument of the ancient world had simply disappeared from human knowledge, as though a veil had been drawn across it, concealing it from view. How was this possible? How could something so famous, so visited, so celebrated, so integral to the identity of Alexandria, simply vanish from memory in the span of a decade? What happened? How could knowledge vanish so completely, so quickly? History provides several possible explanations, each plausible, none certain. In 365 AD, 25 years before Libanius wrote his reference and 35 years before John posed his question, Alexandria was struck by a massive tsunami. The Greek historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who recorded events of the 4th century, noted that the royal palace vanished beneath the waves, and ships were hurled 3 kilometers inland. The harbour was fundamentally reshaped. The coastline itself was altered. If the Somma was located in an area prone to flooding, in the low-lying areas near the harbour, it might have been buried beneath sand and water brought in by the tidal wave. If it was damaged but not destroyed, the authorities might have sealed it to prevent further deterioration. If it was partially destroyed, the remains might have been rebuilt in a different location, known only to a few people, those few fading without passing on the knowledge to the next generation. But earthquake and tsunami are not the only explanation. The rise of Christianity transformed Alexandria fundamentally, from a centre of pagan worship into a city of Christian pilgrimage. In 391 AD, just 1 year after Libanius wrote his reference, the Emperor Theodosius I issued an edict that changed everything. No one is to go to the sanctuaries, the decree read, walk through the temples or raise his eyes to statues created by the labour of man. All across the Roman Empire, pagan temples were being destroyed or sealed. In Alexandria specifically, in that very year, the Great Serapeum was destroyed. The building that had housed an enormous statue of the god Serapis, the building that had been a centre of learning and worship for centuries, was torn down. Libraries were burned. Centuries of accumulated knowledge were lost. If the Somma was still standing as a pagan shrine in 391 AD, it would have been vulnerable to this same wave of religious transformation, this purge of the old gods. Christian zealots, acting under the authority of the emperor's edict, might have deliberately sealed the Somma, hidden it, or destroyed it to prevent pagans from continuing their worship there, to prevent pilgrimages to a pagan monument. A historian of the period, one who witnessed or recorded these transformations, reflected on this watershed moment. The temple of a god becomes a ruin when the god ceases to be believed in. The Somma, which had stood as a beacon of Alexander's immortal fame, now became an embarrassment to a Christian world that had no place for pagan heroes, no room for the veneration of pre-Christian greatness. Whether the tomb was buried by sand and earthquake, or deliberately hidden by priests attempting to protect it, or simply abandoned as the city transformed around it, the end result was the same. The tomb passed from living memory into legend, from fact into mystery. By the time of the Arab conquest of Alexandria in 641 AD, well over 200 years later, there were no recorded attempts by any authority to recover or examine the tomb. Either it was already lost, already destroyed, already transformed beyond recognition, or it was so thoroughly hidden that no one in that era knew where to look. The Islamic historians who recorded the conquest made no mention of searching for Alexander's remains. It was as though the tomb had never existed, as though it had been a dream or a collective hallucination of the earlier centuries. What lies beneath the streets of Alexandria today, beneath the modern apartment buildings and shops and restaurants and cafes that cover the ancient city, beneath the 20th century additions and 21st century developments, no one can say with absolute certainty. Archaeologists have searched repeatedly over the past 2 centuries without success. Heinrich Schliemann, the man who discovered the ancient city of Troy and proved conclusively that Homer's legends were based on historical reality, requested permission in 1888 to excavate what he believed might be the tomb's location near the Nabi Daniel Mosque in Alexandria. Permission was denied by Egyptian authorities, and the search was never conducted. The site remains unexcavated to this very day, sealed by bureaucratic caution and cultural sensitivity. Schliemann would pass away without ever having the chance to look for Alexander's tomb, without ever realizing his dream of discovering the body that had eluded history for so long. When Schliemann made his request, he spoke to an Egyptian official about why he believed the tomb might be located there. The official listened carefully, then shook his head. "That place is sacred to the Islamic tradition now," he said. "It is a mosque and a holy site. We cannot disturb it." Schliemann protested, "But Alexander is history itself. He belongs to all humanity, not to any single faith." The official replied, "Perhaps, but history lives in books, in stories, in memory. The location we must protect." And so the search was forbidden, the excavation was denied, and the mystery was allowed to continue. Scholars have proposed competing theories about what happened to the body. Some believe the body was transported to Venice by Venetian merchants in the year 828 AD and now lies beneath the altar of the Basilica of St. Mark, venerated by thousands upon thousands of pilgrims every year as the remains of the Apostle St. Mark. Andrew Chugg, a modern scholar who devoted decades to stuffarding this theory, published his evidence and wrote, "The body preserved beneath the altar matches Alexander in age and origin. The transfer to Venice explains why the tomb vanished from Alexandria. The relics of St. Mark are, I believe, the relics of Alexander the Great. But the Italian Catholic Church has never authorized excavation to test this theory. The saint's remains remain undisturbed. Others argue that the tomb was destroyed in the tsunami of 365 AD, leaving nothing but scattered bones that eventually dissolved into dust and sediment. Still others suggest it lies buried beneath modern Alexandria, preserved in waterlogged conditions, waiting in the earth for modern archaeologists with advanced technology to discover it." A modern archaeologist, Dr. Zahi Hawass, stated, "The tomb of Alexander is the greatest archaeological prize in the world. If it exists, if it can be found, it will be the discovery of the century. We should search for it." But budgets are limited, and political sensitivities are great. The search has not been seriously undertaken. Others propose that Christian monks, during the religious upheaval of the late 4th century, hid the body deliberately, moving Alexander's remains to protect them from destruction by Christian zealots who had no love for pagan heroes. Still others claim that Islamic authorities, after the conquest of Alexandria in 641 AD, simply abandoned the site, leaving it to be buried by the shifting sands of the Nile Delta, which moves constantly, reshaping the landscape, erasing what was once visible and hiding what was once lost. A medieval chronicler, reflecting on the passage of centuries, imagined the final moments of the soma's existence. The walls crumble. The marble that once gleamed white in the Mediterranean sun now crumbles into dust and rubble. The great sarcophagus, whether of glass or alabaster, cracks beneath the weight of time and neglect and the forces of nature. The body that had been preserved for centuries, visible to emperors and philosophers, kings and soldiers, to conquerors and dreamers, gradually disintegrates, and the memory follows. The people forget. The historians cease to write. The scholars lose the knowledge. The city transforms around it. Gardens grow where temples once stood. Houses are built. New cities rise above old cities, and Alexander, who conquered the known world, is lost within the one city that would forever keep his memory alive in name if not in fact. His tomb vanishes, and no one remembers that it had ever existed. But was it truly lost? Or was it deliberately hidden by someone? Preserved in a secret location known only to a few, kept safe from destruction by those who understood that the final resting place of the greatest conqueror must never fall into the hands of those who would desecrate it. That question remains unanswered after nearly 2,000 years. That mystery remains unsolved, and the body of Alexander the Great, conqueror of the ancient world, lies somewhere in the earth, waiting. Waiting beneath the streets of Alexandria, beneath layers of sand and stone and modern concrete. Waiting in some undiscovered crypt, hidden in a basement, concealed in a vault, waiting perhaps in a Venetian basilica, resting beneath marble and prayer, waiting for history to finally reveal its greatest secret, waiting for the day when archaeologists will discover what became of the man who changed everything. The silence that descended after 215 AD, after Caracalla's final visit to the tomb, after that last emperor departed the Somma and sealed it once more, stretches across nearly 1800 years. It is a silence unbroken by any official record, any confirmed sighting, any certain knowledge. And in that silence, one of history's most compelling and enduring mysteries continues to haunt us. Where is Alexander? Where is the tomb? And what will we do when we finally find it? The sun had begun to set over Alexandria when Caracalla stood before the sarcophagus one final time. It was 215 AD. He had removed his own tunic, his ring, his belt. With reverent hands, he placed them carefully on the glass sarcophagus beside Alexander. The greatest military mind in history lay still and preserved in that translucent vessel, looking almost as though he might wake at any moment, and Caracalla, obsessed as he was with Alexander, with dressing as Alexander, with declaring himself the spiritual successor to the man who had conquered the entire known world, left those offerings in silence. According to the Byzantine historian John of Antioch, Caracalla spoke softly to the corpse before departing. "You are the measure," he said, "and I am your echo." He turned and walked out into the afternoon light of Alexandria. The doors closed behind him, and then something remarkable happened. The world forgot. Caracalla would be the last recorded visitor to Alexander's tomb. After 215 AD, the historical record goes silent. For 1,000 years before, the tomb had been perhaps the most visited shrine in the ancient world. Julius Caesar had wept before it, comparing his own achievements at the same age and finding himself wanting. The great Roman general had spoken aloud to the statue and the remains. While Alexander, at my age, was already king of so many peoples, I have as yet achieved no brilliant success. His voice had echoed in that chamber, the voice of one conqueror mourning before another. Augustus had placed golden wreaths upon the sarcophagus and, according to Cassius Dio, accidentally damaged it, his fingers catching on the nose of the corpse, breaking ancient cartilage that had somehow survived untouched for centuries. Caligula became so obsessed with Alexander that he wore the man's breastplate as his own, a piece of armour that had never left the tomb in all the centuries before, until one emperor's obsession drove him to this theft. Septimius Severus himself had come to seal the entrance in 200 AD, fearing more looting, more violation. He had brought with him his wife Julia Domna and the historian Cassius Dio so that they might bear witness to what he was doing. According to Dio's account, Severus had spoken these words as he examined the sarcophagus. "I seal this place of greatness against the hands of the disrespectful. Let no emperor after me disturb the rest of this man." Some sources claim he gathered sacred papyri from temples throughout Alexandria and placed them inside the glass sarcophagus for safekeeping. "Let the tomb preserve these treasures," he was said to have commanded, "as it has preserved the greatest conqueror." But after Caracalla's visit, the silence was complete. What happened in those years between 215 AD and 400 AD remains one of history's deepest mysteries. The tomb that had been visited by emperors and generals for 400 years suddenly vanished from all records. The Somma, the name itself means simply the body in ancient Greek, had stood at the intersection of Alexandria's two greatest streets, the Canopic Way and the Street of the Somma. It was not a hidden monument. It was not obscure or difficult to find. It was central. It was famous. It was the heart of the royal quarter. And yet, all that history has left us is a name, a location that is now uncertain, and a mystery that deepens with each passing century. In the years after Caracalla's departure, Alexandria continued as it always had. The city remained the intellectual and commercial heart of the Mediterranean world. Scholars still studied in the libraries, merchants still sailed from its harbours, the streets still flowed with people from every corner of the known world. But something was changing in the city, something that would eventually claim even the greatest monuments. The first great rupture came in 273 AD, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Aurelian. The empire itself was fracturing, tearing apart from within. Entire regions had begun to act independently, declaring their own rulers, their own kingdoms. Egypt had become a stronghold of instability, a place where rival powers battled for supremacy. In Alexandria, the royal quarter, the Brocchion district where the Soma stood, became a centre of that conflict. When Aurelian's forces moved to reassert Roman control, they brought fire and violence with them. A historian might have written, standing in those streets, "The glory of the Ptolemies burns today. The heart of the city is consumed by the fever of war." The devastation was nearly complete. The district that had housed the Ptolemaic royal palaces for centuries was engulfed in flames. Soldiers fought street by street. Buildings that had stood for generations crumbled into rubble, and the royal quarter, the Brocchion, the sacred space where the tomb of Alexander had rested in honour for nearly 3 centuries, was transformed into a battlefield. The exact extent of the damage to the Soma itself remains unclear. Some sources suggest it was partially destroyed. Others imply it was severely looted. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing about this period, observed that the flames spared nothing in the royal quarter. What is certain is that, after 273 AD, the tomb was no longer the centre of pilgrimage it had been. The violence had disrupted something fundamental, the sense of safety, the certainty that one could visit this sacred place unmolested. 87 years later, in 365 AD, another catastrophe struck. This one came not from the conflicts of men, but from the earth itself. On July 21st, 365 AD, in the late afternoon, an enormous earthquake erupted from the crust near Crete. Geologists today estimate its magnitude at 8.5 or greater, one of the largest seismic events ever to strike the Mediterranean world. The energy released was unimaginable, and it did something almost worse than an earthquake's usual devastation. It created a tsunami. A wall of water, perhaps 20 meters high, rushed across the Mediterranean toward the coasts. It struck Alexandria with tremendous force. The ancient chronicler Ammianus Marcellinus described what happened in terms that still convey the terror. Ships were lifted high above the usual water level and cast far inland, some as far as the city streets themselves. The earth trembled. The waves came like mountains. His account continues. The palace, wonder of the world, was swallowed by the sea. Everything that had stood was now scattered like toys abandoned by an angry child. Estimates suggest that 5,000 people lost their lives in Alexandria alone, and 50,000 buildings were destroyed or severely damaged. The eastern harbour areas of the ancient city were fundamentally altered. What had been solid ground became flooded. What had been carefully planned streets and structures became a landscape of ruins and mud and the mingled salt of the sea. Ships that had been tied in the harbour were lifted by the rising water and carried inland, some as far as 3 kilometres into the city. The royal palace reportedly vanished beneath the waves entirely. Modern scholarship has debated the exact extent of the tsunami's damage. Some sedimentary evidence suggests the destruction was less severe than the ancient accounts implied, but there is no question that Alexandria's coastline and harbour areas were transformed, and if the Soma had been located in areas vulnerable to flooding, as some scholars believe it would have been damaged or perhaps entirely buried beneath the silt and debris that the tsunami left behind. A traveller might have walked through the city in the days after and asked local residents, "Where stands the tomb of Alexander?" And the locals might have shrugged and pointed to the mud, to the displaced buildings, to the harbour waters that had flowed through streets where the Soma once stood. Perhaps it is underwater now, some would have said. Perhaps it has been washed away. Perhaps it never existed except in our memories. Between the violence of 273 AD and the tsunami of 365 AD, the tomb of Alexander had suffered 2 tremendous assaults, and yet the silence in the historical record was not yet absolute. There were still writers who knew of the tomb, who could describe it, who could reference its existence. But that would change with the coming of a man and a decree that would reshape the entire spiritual landscape of the Mediterranean world. In 391 AD, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I issued an edict. It was brief, it was unambiguous, and it would change the fate of every pagan shrine in the empire forever. The text of the decree survives in the legal codes. It states, in terms that leave no room for interpretation, no one is to go to the sanctuaries, walk through the temples, or raise his eyes to statues created by the labour of man. Theodosius I was a Christian. He had decided that the old gods, the gods that had been worshipped for 1,000 years, had no place in the empire he ruled. Every temple, every shrine, every place of pagan worship was to be closed. The decree left no room for negotiation. It left no room for reverence toward the past. It left no room for those who believed in the old ways. And on June 16th, 391 AD, a follow-up edict reinforced the message with even greater force. Paganism was finished. Christianity would be the only religion permitted in the Roman Empire. A theologian reading this decree might have said, "The age of the gods has ended. Now begins the age of the one God." In Alexandria, the effect was catastrophic for the old world. The great Serapeum, the temple of Serapis that had stood for centuries as one of the wonders of the ancient world, was attacked and destroyed. Its library was burned. The great collection of pagan wisdom that had been gathered there was lost. Statues were toppled. Sacred spaces that had been honoured since the days of the Ptolemies were desecrated. And the Somma, that magnificent mausoleum built to honour Alexander, was a pagan shrine. It was filled with the artefacts and relics of pagan worship. It was a place where thousands had made offerings to Alexander as though he were a god. It stood at the intersection of two great streets, impossible to ignore, impossible to hide. What happened to the Somma in those years after 391 AD remains unclear. The historical record offers several possibilities, all of them plausible, none of them entirely certain. One possibility is that the tomb was destroyed outright by zealous Christians, who saw it as an abomination, a monument to pagan idolatry that had no place in the new Christian empire. Another possibility is that it was sealed, hidden away deliberately to protect it from desecration, or to prevent its continued veneration as a pagan shrine. A third is that it was simply abandoned, left to decay as pilgrims no longer came to visit it, as the religious fervour that had sustained it for nearly 4 centuries simply evaporated in the wake of Theodosius's decrees. A fourth, whispered in some ancient texts, is that the tomb was deliberately concealed by Christians who understood its value, but wished to preserve it from the hands of those who would loot it. They might have thought, "We will hide this for a time, until the fury of these religious battles passes. We will preserve it for future generations." What we know with certainty is that by the year 400 AD, the tomb had become not just unavailable, but unknown. The memory of its location had simply been erased. Sometime around the year 400 AD, the church father John Chrysostom visited Alexandria. Chrysostom was a great theologian, a man of learning and authority in the Christian church. He had come to see the city where so much of Christian history had been written, and at some point during his visit he asked the people of Alexandria a question that would echo through the centuries. The question appears in various forms in different sources, but the meaning is consistent. "Tell me," he said, according to some accounts, "where is the tomb of Alexander?" According to other accounts, his question was phrased differently. "I've heard it said that Alexander the Great was buried in this city. Can you show me where? I wish to pray there, to understand what greatness meant to the people of old." The people of Alexandria had no answer for him. Local historians and guides shook their heads. The merchants and citizens could only repeat what they had heard, that once there had been such a place, but where it was, nobody knew anymore. Some accounts suggest his exact words were different again. "His tomb, even his own people know not. Where is it?" But the meaning was the same. The greatest conqueror in human history, the man whose body had been visited by emperors and generals for 400 years, whose tomb had been one of the most famous monuments in the world, had vanished so completely that no one could even remember where it was. A silence had fallen over the city, a silence as complete as the silence of passing itself. The question itself is remarkable. It is the first explicit historical record we have that the tomb's location had become unknown, and Chrysostom's bewilderment was surely echoed by thousands of others living in Alexandria at that time. How could something so famous, so revered, so central to the city's identity simply disappear? Where could it go? How could the world simply forget? There is another figure from the same period, a man named Libanius, who provides perhaps the last glimpse we have of the tomb during the ancient world. Libanius was a Greek rhetorician and writer, a man who lived through the religious upheavals of the late 4th century. Around 390 AD, just a year or so before Chrysostom asked his famous question, Libanius made a reference in his writings to the tomb of Alexander. "Alexandria," he wrote, "where the corpse of Alexander is displayed, remains the greatest city in the world." The word displayed carries significance. Libanius believed, or had been told, that Alexander's body could still be seen, that it was still visible to those who came to look upon it, that it was still being preserved and honoured. But this would be one of the last times in the historical record that anyone would claim to have actually witnessed the remains. After Libanius's account in 390 AD, the next clear statement of the tomb's location and status would not come for nearly 2,000 years. The knowledge had been lost. The memory had faded. The greatest monument in the ancient world had become invisible. In the years and centuries that followed, Alexandria itself would undergo profound transformations. The city would be conquered, its population would shift, its spiritual centre would move from the temples and shrines of the ancient world to the mosques and churches of a new era. The very streets of the city would change. New buildings would be constructed on top of old. The earth would shift and settle. The harbour would shift. The sea would reclaim some areas while other areas rose. And beneath it all, somewhere in the accumulation of centuries, the tomb of Alexander remained hidden, accessible to no one, known to no one. In 641 AD, the Arab conquest led by Amr ibn al-As brought Islamic rule to Alexandria. The city fell after a period of siege and negotiation. The Byzantine governor signed a treaty. The conquerors entered the city, and as the power of Christianity in the Mediterranean world began its long decline, and a new religion and a new culture took its place, the tomb of Alexander faded further into obscurity. The historical records from this period do not mention the Somma. There is no account of what the Arab conquerors did with the tomb, no description of whether they attempted to preserve it, looted it, or simply left it to crumble. The silence continued. One might imagine a conversation between Muslim scholars entering Alexandria. There was a great tomb here, we're told, the tomb of the Greek king Alexander. Do you see it? No, I see no such thing. Perhaps it was destroyed. Perhaps it was never here at all. Perhaps the stories were merely stories, and nothing more. 1,000 years would pass before the next concrete reference to the tomb appeared in any historical record. In 1517, a traveller named Leo Africanus made a journey through Egypt. Leo was a scholar and geographer, a man who had travelled extensively through North Africa and the Muslim world. He wrote accounts of the cities and monuments he encountered, and in his description of Africa, he claimed that while travelling in Alexandria, local guides had shown him what they believed to be the tomb of Alexander. According to Leo's account, it was a small chapel, modest in its construction, located in what he believed to be the ancient royal quarter. He described it with the certainty of a man who had been shown something specific, something that the locals themselves claimed to remember. Here, he said the guides told him, beneath this place sleeps Alexander. But Leo himself expressed some doubt. He noted that the structure seemed too small, too modest, too obviously later in construction to be the great Somma that the ancient writers had described. But scholars in later centuries would question whether what Leo Africanus saw was actually Alexander's tomb, or simply a local legend, a tourist attraction, a story that had been preserved and transmitted through the centuries even though the truth of it had been lost. The ambiguity remains to this day. Did Leo see the actual Somma, preserved in some form through all those centuries, decayed and diminished but still standing? Or did he see an empty chapel, a space that had once housed the tomb but now held only the memory of what had been? Or did he see something that had no connection to Alexander at all, merely a building that locals had decided to associate with the legendary king because of its location? By the time the modern era arrived, the mystery had deepened to the point of complete obscurity. The tomb of Alexander the Great, one of the most famous monuments in the ancient world, had become a ghost story. Everyone knew the legend. Few believed the tomb actually existed, and no one knew where to look. But as the 19th century progressed, as archaeological methods advanced and excavation became a science rather than grave robbing, people began to search in earnest. In 1888, an extraordinary man named Heinrich Schliemann came to Alexandria. Schliemann was famous throughout Europe as the archaeologist who had discovered Troy. For decades, skeptical scholars had doubted that Troy existed at all. They believed it to be purely legendary, a place invented by Homer in his epic poems. But Schliemann had refused to accept that. He had studied the text carefully, he had looked for clues in Homer's descriptions, and he had begun to dig in what he believed to be the correct location in modern-day Turkey. And he had found Troy. He had found the ruins of the ancient city. He had proven the skeptics wrong. He had transformed archaeology from a pastime of amateur collectors into a rigorous scientific discipline. Schliemann had become a legend in his own time. Museums and universities sought his advice. Kings and emperors invited him to speak. Now, emboldened by his success at Troy, Schliemann turned his attention to another great mystery. If Troy existed, perhaps other legendary places existed as well. Perhaps the tomb of Alexander, lost for so many centuries, could be found. Schliemann applied to the Egyptian authorities for permission to excavate in Alexandria. He had money, he had fame, he had experience, he had a track record of success. He had done the impossible before. Surely he could do it again. The Egyptian authorities refused him. What their exact reasons were, the historical record does not make entirely clear, but it is likely that they were concerned about the religious and cultural sensitivity of the excavation. Alexander's tomb, if found, would be in what was now part of the Islamic world. The sites were sacred to the people living there, and Cairo was not eager to see a European archaeologist conducting large-scale excavations in their most important city. There were also concerns about what might be done with any remains that were found. Would they be taken to Europe? Would they be displayed in Western museums? Would Egypt lose control of its own treasures? Schliemann's request was denied, and the opportunity to search comprehensively for the tomb was lost. The great archaeologist would turn his attention elsewhere. He would not be the one to solve this mystery, and yet, the mystery had captured the imagination of people around the world. If Schliemann could not dig, others could theorize, others could search, others could propose solutions to the mystery. And as the 20th century unfolded, a series of increasingly specific claims emerged about where Alexander's tomb might be. One of the most persistent of these claims centers on the Nabi Daniel Mosque in central Alexandria. The mosque is located in what archaeologists believe was part of the ancient royal quarter, in the general vicinity of where the Somma would have been located. Local legend in Alexandria has long held that beneath the mosque, in an underground chamber, lies the tomb of Alexander. The locals speak of it with certainty. They know the stories. They have heard the legends passed down through generations. Some accounts suggest that the original building on this site was constructed as a chapel, and that chapel was built to house the tomb of Alexander, which was then later incorporated into the mosque structure when Islamic rule came to the city. In the 19th century, an underground surveyor named Mahmud el-Falaki conducted an extensive survey of the ground beneath Alexandria. He documented numerous underground corridors and chambers, the remnants of ancient construction. Some of these structures, he suggested, might be connected to the royal quarter. Some sources claim that el-Falaki himself believed the tomb might lie beneath the Nabi Daniel Mosque. The surveyor's work remains valuable to archaeologists even today. His maps and descriptions of the underground structure of Alexandria are studied by researchers trying to understand what lies beneath the modern city. But the actual location of the tomb remained hidden even to him. Schliemann, when he was trying to gain permission for his excavations, apparently focused on this location as his primary target. He believed that if he could dig beneath or near the mosque, he might find the tomb, but the Egyptian authorities would not permit it. A mosque is a sacred place in Islam. You do not excavate beneath a mosque. You do not disturb the ground of a functioning place of worship. The very idea is taboo. The faithful pray there 5 times a day. The gone are buried there with reverence. To dig would be to violate the holiest of holy places. This has remained the situation to the present day. The Nabi Daniel Mosque still stands in central Alexandria, in the same location where it has stood for centuries. Beneath it, according to local legend and some archaeological theory, lies the tomb of Alexander. The locals maintain their certainty. Visitors to the mosque sometimes ask the imams if it is true, if Alexander really lies beneath them. The response is usually diplomatic. Perhaps. Who knows the secrets that lie beneath the earth? But no excavation has ever been permitted. No scientific investigation has ever been conducted. The mosque stands as both the most likely location and the most inaccessible one. The tomb may be just meters beneath the feet of worshippers, or it may be entirely elsewhere. We simply do not know, and we likely never will, unless the religious and political sensitivities surrounding the mosque change in some fundamental way. But there were other theories emerging as well. If the tomb was not in Alexandria, some scholars began to ask, where else could it be? In 1995, a Greek archaeologist named Liana Suvaltsi proposed an intriguing answer. She claimed that Alexander had always wanted to be buried at Siwa, the ancient oasis in southwestern Egypt, far from the Mediterranean coast. In the ancient sources, we do find evidence that Alexander wanted this. He travelled to Siwa to consult the oracle of Zeus Ammon, one of the most sacred shrines in the ancient world.